In 1949, a single tomato in Florida would have knocked you backward with flavor. Today, that same variety, grown by the same methods, tastes like almost nothing. And the strange part is, nobody poisoned it, nobody swapped it out, and nobody did anything you'd call sabotage. Scientists just kept doing exactly what they were told to do, generation after generation, and the flavor disappeared as a side effect nobody was watching for. Here's the number that should stop you cold. Researchers comparing heirloom tomato genetics to modern commercial varieties found that some of today's most widely grown tomatoes are missing genetic material tied directly to flavor compounds, deleted not by accident, but because breeders selected for something else entirely and dragged the flavor genes out the door with it. You didn't imagine it. Your grandfather's tomato really was better, and there's a paper trail proving exactly why. This matters because it's not really a story about tomatoes. It's a story about what happens when an entire industry optimizes for the wrong metric for 70 straight years. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why almost every tomato in your grocery store shares the same quiet flaw, why one gene mutation from the 1930s is still shaping your dinner today, and what a small number of scientists are now doing to reverse decades of damage. If you're enjoying this so far, subscribe, because a video like this took a stack of genetics papers and a lot of patience to put together, and I want to keep making them. Let's start with the moment the trouble began, because it starts earlier than you'd think, and it starts with a color, not a taste. In the early 20th century, tomatoes ripened unevenly. The shoulders near the stem often stayed green or yellowish, even after the rest of the fruit turned red, a trait farmers called green shoulder. It looked imperfect. It photographed badly. And in an industry that was starting to sell produce on appearance as much as taste, imperfect was a problem. So breeders went looking for a fix, and in the 1930s they found one. A natural mutation that made tomatoes ripen to a uniform, glowing red all the way through, no green shoulders, no blotchy patches. It was called the uniform ripening gene, and it seemed like a pure win. Prettier tomatoes, easier to sell, no downside anyone could see. But here's what nobody understood for another 80 years. That gene wasn't just controlling color. Attached to that same stretch of DNA was a gene called GLK2, and GLK2 does something you'd never guess from its name. It controls how many chloroplasts sit inside the unripe green fruit, and chloroplasts are tiny sugar factories. More chloroplasts in the green fruit means more photosynthesis happening before the tomato ripens, which means more sugar and more flavor compounds built up inside by the time you eat it. When breeders selected for uniform ripening, they accidentally selected against chloroplast density, and they didn't find out until 2012 when a team of scientists sequenced the gene and realized the entire industry had been trading flavor for looks since the Great Depression, without a single person intending to. Think about that for a second. A choice made to solve a cosmetic issue before World War II is still sitting in the DNA of the tomato on your sandwich right now. But the uniform ripening gene was only the opening move. What came next was bigger, and it wasn't an accident at all. By the 1960s and 70s, tomato farming had turned into an industrial supply chain, and supply chains don't care about flavor, they care about three things: yield, durability, and shelf life. A tomato that tastes incredible but bruises if you look at it wrong is a nightmare to ship 1,000 miles in a truck. A tomato that ripens on its own schedule instead of a predictable one throws off harvest logistics. So breeders started selecting hard for thick skins that resist bruising, for fruit that ripens uniformly on command, and for plants that produce enormous yields per acre. Every one of those traits made business sense, and every one of those traits, it turns out, competes directly against the biological pathways that build flavor. Here's the part that really explains why your grandfather's tomato hit different. Flavor in a tomato isn't one thing. It's a chemical balancing act between sugars, acids, and a set of volatile aroma compounds so small in quantity that early food scientists barely noticed them. Researchers eventually identified roughly 30 distinct volatile compounds that meaningfully shape how a tomato tastes and smells, things with names like geraniol and 6-methyl-5-heptan-2,1, compounds so minor by weight that you could remove them and never see it on a nutrition label, yet your brain and your nose register their absence instantly as blandness. And here's the trap. Plants only have so much energy. Every calorie a tomato plant spends building a thicker skin, or growing a bigger fruit, or ripening faster is a calorie it isn't spending building those 30 flavor compounds. Breeders were never told to reduce flavor. They were just told to maximize yield, size, and shelf stability, and the tomato paid for it out of the only budget it had. But that's still not the whole story, because even a tomato bred with decent genetics can be ruined after it's picked, and this next part might make you angrier than the genetics did. Modern commercial tomatoes are almost always picked while still green and hard, then artificially ripened later using ethylene gas, a natural plant hormone that triggers the color change from green to red. This isn't some sinister shortcut. It's a genuine engineering necessity. A vine-ripened tomato is fragile and has maybe a few days of usable life. A green tomato picked hard can survive a truck ride across the country without turning to mush. So the industry made a trade, and once again, it traded flavor for logistics. Ethylene gas will turn a tomato red, but color and flavor are controlled by almost entirely separate biological pathways. You can gas a tomato into looking perfectly ripe, while the sugars, acids, and volatile compounds inside never finish developing the way they would have if that tomato had ripened naturally on the vine, pulling nutrients from the plant until the very last moment. What you're left with is something that looks finished on the outside and is unfinished on the inside, a tomato wearing a costume of ripeness. And then there's the step that might be the biggest flavor killer of them all, and it happens in your own refrigerator. Tomatoes are a warm climate fruit, and their cell membranes are built for warm climate storage. Once you drop a tomato below about 54 degrees Fahrenheit, something happens at the cellular level called chilling injury. The membranes inside the fruit cells begin to break down, and the enzymes responsible for producing those volatile flavor compounds get damaged, sometimes permanently. Cold doesn't just pause a tomato's flavor development the way it would with, say, an apple. It actively destroys the machinery that makes flavor possible in the first place. Researchers at the University of Florida found that tomatoes stored at refrigerator temperatures lost significant amounts of key flavor volatiles within just a single day, and that damage didn't reverse when the tomato warmed back up. So somewhere in the supply chain, whether it's a distribution warehouse, a grocery store cooler, or your own fridge at home, a genuinely decent tomato can get quietly wrecked by something as simple and well-intentioned as trying to keep it fresh. Add that up. A gene deleted for cosmetic reasons in the 1930s, 70 years of breeding for yield, skin thickness, and shipping durability at the direct expense of flavor chemistry. Harvesting green and finishing with gas instead of sunlight. And then, for good measure, storing the survivors in exactly the temperature range that breaks their flavor-producing enzymes. It's not one villain. It's 4 separate, individually reasonable decisions stacking on top of each other for almost a century, and the tomato is the one absorbing all of it. Now, you might be wondering whether heirloom tomatoes solve all of this, and the honest answer is complicated, which almost nobody tells you. Heirlooms dodge some of these problems. They generally still carry the old chloroplast-producing genetics, and they're usually vine-ripened rather than gassed. But they were never bred for consistency, which is exactly why one heirloom tomato from your garden can be extraordinary, and the one right next to it can be mediocre, sometimes even from the same plant. Heirlooms trade the industrial system's consistency for a shot at real flavor. And that trade only works if you're growing them yourself or buying from someone who is, not if you're buying them shipped and refrigerated through the exact same supply chain that damages everything else. So is there any actual fix? Or is this just permanent damage we're all stuck living with? This is where the story gets genuinely hopeful, and it's happening right now, not in some distant future. At the University of Florida, a plant scientist named Harry Klee spent years doing something almost nobody else in the industry had bothered to do. Instead of chemically analyzing what makes a tomato firm or what makes it ship well, his lab methodically identified exactly which volatile compounds the human palate actually associates with good tomato flavor, then went looking for heirloom and wild tomato varieties that still carried strong versions of the genes responsible for producing them. His team essentially built a flavor map of tomato genetics, something the industry had never prioritized, building in 100 years of breeding for everything except taste. Using that map, breeders can now cross modern commercial tomatoes with older, flavor-rich genetic lines and select offspring for taste chemistry directly, instead of stumbling into flavor by accident or losing it by accident, the way the entire industry had for generations. Some of that work has already reached grocery stores under new commercial tomato lines specifically marketed on flavor rather than just size or shelf life. Proof that you can rebuild what was lost if you actually decide flavor matters enough to breed for it on purpose. But the honest reality is that these flavor-forward varieties still represent a small slice of a massive global supply chain built for 70 years around completely different priorities. Skin thickness still matters for shipping. Uniform ripening still matters for retail displays. Refrigeration is still the default because nobody's about to redesign global cold chain logistics around one fruit's chemistry. The fix exists, but it's competing against decades of infrastructure built for the opposite goal, and infrastructure doesn't turn around fast. Which brings us to the part of this you actually have some control over, sitting in your kitchen tonight. If you want a tomato closer to what your grandfather ate, the science tells you exactly what to do, and none of it requires special knowledge, just working with the biology instead of against it. Never refrigerate a fresh tomato if you can help it. Keep it on the counter because every hour below 54 degrees is quietly damaging enzymes that don't come back. Look for vine-ripened labeling when you can find it, because it means the tomato finished its flavor development on the plant instead of in a gas chamber after an early harvest. And if you really want to taste what changed, grow one heirloom variety yourself, or find a farmer's market grower who does, because that's the closest thing left to tasting a tomato the way it existed before uniform ripening, before industrial shipping, and before the refrigerator became the default place we store a fruit that was never built to live there. The tomato on your plate isn't broken because someone made a bad decision. It's the accumulated result of 100 good decisions made by 100 different people solving 100 different problems, none of whom were ever specifically asked to protect flavor, and all of whom were quietly told, without anyone saying it out loud, that flavor was the one thing that could be sacrificed first. Now that you know the actual mechanism behind it, the gene, the gas, the cold, you'll never look at a grocery store tomato the same way again, and honestly, you shouldn't. If this changed how you'll shop for tomatoes, hit like because it helps. This reached the people still wondering why their tomatoes taste like nothing. Tell me in the comments if you've grown heirlooms yourself and noticed the difference. And subscribe if you want more stories like this one, where the real explanation was hiding in plain sight the whole time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.